Tonight, let yourself drift back, nearly 4,600 years, to the banks of a great river in the warm south, where a city of workers is slowly waking beside the rising shape of the largest thing human hands have ever built. The Nile glows gold in the first light. Fishermen push their reed boats onto the still water, and on the plateau above, a pyramid waits, half-finished, for the men just now rising to climb toward it. No one here is in any hurry this morning. Neither are we. Welcome. Settle in, dim the lights, and let yourself grow still. This is the Hush Historian. Close your eyes, if you like. I will take it from here. In the workers' village at the foot of the plateau, the morning began as it always began, with thin threads of smoke rising from the bread ovens and the low murmur of a community waking to another ordinary day. Rows of modest mud brick houses stood close together, warm in the first light, and the smell of baking bread already drifted through the narrow lanes. This was not a village of slaves, whatever later ages would come to imagine. It was a village of craftsmen, of paid and fed and respected workers, who had come from across the land to build something none of them would ever fully see completed. In one of those small mud brick houses, Kaha woke before the others did, as he did most mornings. He lay still a moment on his reed sleeping mat, listening to the quiet breathing of the household around him, to the faint sounds of the village beginning to stir beyond the walls. He was a stonemason, and the leader of a work gang, and the shaping and setting of great stones was the work of his hands and the work of his life. He rose quietly in the dim light and prepared himself for the day ahead, as he had for more years than he cared to count. His tools lay where he had left them the night before, a copper chisel worn smooth by his grip, and a heavy wooden mallet, resting on a block of pale limestone dusted white with the fine powder of his trade. Kaha checked them by habit, testing the chisel's edge with his thumb, the way his own father had once taught him to. Good tools, kept sharp and ready, were the difference between a clean day's work and a wasted one, and Kaha had never in his life allowed himself the carelessness of a dull blade or a cracked handle. He stepped out into the cool morning air and began the walk he had walked 10,000 times, along the sandy path that led from the village up toward the plateau. Ahead of him, growing clearer with every step as the light strengthened, rose the great pyramid itself, unfinished still but already vast beyond anything else in the world, its pale stone catching the first gold of the sun. Kaha had watched it grow, course by course, across the long years of his working life, and still, some mornings, its sheer scale stopped him for a moment where he stood. Back in the village, the day's work of another kind had already begun. Nefer and the other women stood at the tall clay ovens, baking the round loaves of bread that would feed the thousands of workers on the plateau, and tending the great jars where the beer was brewed. Bread and beer were the foundation of everything here, the daily ration that kept the work gang strong, and the women who made them were as essential to the pyramid as any mason on the stones. Their ovens glowed warm in the morning dark, and the smell of their labor filled the waking village. The workers' ration was simple but generous, for a well-fed worker was a strong worker, and the ones who built for the king were kept strong indeed. Round flatbread, thick jars of beer, onions, dried fish, laid out and distributed each day to the gangs before they climbed to their labor. Kaha had heard travelers from distant lands speak of workers who were starved and driven, and he did not understand such a thing. Here, a man was fed for his work, and paid for it, and remembered for it, and the stones rose faster for it than any whip could ever have driven them. At the base of the pyramid, the work gangs gathered in the strengthening light, hundreds upon hundreds of workers assembling for the day, organized into teams with names they carried with pride. Kaha found his own gang among the gathering crowd, the men he had worked beside for years, and took his place at their head. Above them all rose the pyramid, so large now that a man standing at its foot could not take in the whole of it at once, and the gathered workers seemed, against its scale, like ants at the base of a mountain that they themselves had somehow raised. Inini was already at work when Kaha arrived. The old man crouched beside a fresh limestone block, marking it carefully with a reed brush dipped in red pigment, laying out the lines the cutters would follow. Inini was the eldest of the gang, and had worked on the pyramid of the king's father before this one, and there was little about stone that his long life had not taught him. Kaha had learned much of his own craft from this man, and still, on the hardest problems, it was to Inini that he turned. The quarry lay a short distance from the pyramid itself, a great wound cut into the bedrock where the limestone was taken, and here the gangs labored to free the massive blocks from the living rock. It was slow and careful work, cutting channels around each block with copper tools, driving wooden wedges into the cuts, working the stone loose without cracking or wasting it. The air hung thick with pale dust and the steady sound of copper on stone, a rhythm as old, by now, as the pyramid itself. Kaha bent to his own part of the work, driving a wooden wedge into a line cut along a great block, and felt the familiar satisfaction as the stone began, slowly, to give. There was a particular knowledge in this, a feel for exactly where and how hard to strike, that could not be taught in words but only learned across years of patient failure and gradual mastery. Kaha had that knowledge in his hands now, so deeply that he rarely had to think about it at all, and he worked the wedge with the unhurried confidence of a man doing the thing he understood best in all the world. When the block at last came free, Kaha stood and stretched his back, and looked over the gang he led with a quiet, unspoken pride. They were good men, most of them, skilled and steady, and the work they did together was work that would outlast every one of them by ages none of them could imagine. Kaha did not often speak of such things aloud. But he felt them, standing there beside the freed stone, the strange weight of building something that would still be standing long after his own name was forgotten. The moving of the great blocks was the labor that took the whole strength of the gangs together, dozens of men hauling a single enormous stone on a wooden sledge, up the long mud ramps that spiraled the pyramid's growing sides. Ropes creaked taut, feet found their rhythm, and the stone crept forward, arm's length by arm's length, toward the place where it would rest for all the ages to come. It was slow, and it was hard, and there was a strange music in it, the massed voices of the gang calling the rhythm together as they pulled. Before the sledge, a worker walked pouring water onto the sand, wetting the path so the heavy runners would slide more easily over the dampened ground. It was a simple thing, this pouring of water, but it was knowledge won over generations, the understanding that wet sand carried a great weight far more easily than dry, and it saved the gangs an effort that no amount of raw strength could have replaced. Kaha had learned this trick as a boy, and had taught it since to younger men, one small piece of the vast accumulated wisdom that made the impossible merely difficult. Among the haulers strained young Ta, new to the gang this season, learning the rhythm of the ropes the hard way, as every worker did. He was eager, this one, quick to work and slow to complain, and Kaha had marked him early as a boy worth teaching. He pulled a little out of time still, wasting some of his strength, and Kaha made a note to show him, later, how to find the gang's shared rhythm, so that many men pulled as one rather than as many. It was the first lesson of the work, and the most important. On the freed and finished blocks, the gangs carved their names, the proud marks of the teams who had shaped and set each stone, cut deep into the limestone where they would remain long after the hands that cut them were dust. Kaha's own gang had a name they carried with pride, and he had seen it, more than once, on stones already set deep within the pyramid's rising body, hidden now forever from any eye but carrying, still, the quiet declaration that these men had been here, had done this, had been part of something vast. High on the pyramid itself, workers guided a great block into its final place, small figures moving carefully along the rising courses, the whole plateau and the shining ribbon of the Nile spread out far below them. It was dangerous work, this labor at the growing summit, and it demanded a steadiness of nerve as much as of hand, but the men who did it had done it for years, and moved along the high stone with the unbothered ease of long habit. From up there, a worker could see the whole living world at once, the fields, the river, the distant villages, all of it small beneath him. When the sun stood high, the gangs rested, gathering in the shade of temporary shelters raised against the fierce midday heat, drinking their beer and eating their bread, letting the worst of the day's fire pass before returning to the stones. It was a welcome hour, this midday rest, and the talk among the men turned easy and unhurried, of families in the village, of the progress of the work, of the small ordinary concerns that filled the lives of men who happened to be building a wonder. Kaha sat among them, content, in no hurry to move. Inini sat beside Kaha in the shade, and the two of them spoke, as they often did, of the work and of the years, the old man gesturing now and then toward the great structure rising above them. Inini had seen more of this labor than any man living, and he spoke of it with a quiet reverence that had not dimmed across his long life, the sense that they were part of something that reached far beyond any single one of them. Kaha listened, as he had listened for years, gathering the old man's wisdom the way a man gathers water in a dry land, carefully, knowing its worth. The tools of their measuring were simple but exact, a wooden A-frame with a plumb line hung from its peak, used to test whether a stone lay true and level. With such humble instruments the workers achieved a precision that later ages would struggle to believe, courses laid so level and corners cut so square that the eye could find no fault in them. Kaha held the level against a newly set block, watching the plumb line settle, and found the stone true, and moved on to the next, one small perfect piece in a structure of a scale beyond perfection's ordinary meaning. Down on the Nile, boats came and went throughout the day, carrying the finer stone from distant quarries, the white casing limestone and the hard granite that would face and finish the pyramid's body. The river was the road of Egypt, and everything moved upon it, and the great blocks floated down from the south on broad sailing vessels to be unloaded at the plateau's edge. Kaha had never traveled far up that river himself, but he knew its gifts intimately, for the whole of his life's work floated to him upon its patient current. On the pyramid's outer face, workers smoothed the fine white casing stones to a gleaming finish, polishing the limestone until it shone, so that the completed monument would rise pale and brilliant against the desert sky, visible for a great distance in the clear Egyptian light. This was among the most careful work of all, the final surface that the world would see, and it was given to the most skilled and patient hands. Kaha watched a worker draw the polishing stone slowly across the pale surface, and thought of how the finished pyramid would look, blazing white in the sun, long after all of them were gone. In the afternoon, the village lived its own quieter life, apart from the great labor on the plateau, women grinding grain and tending children, the ordinary domestic rhythm of any settlement anywhere. Children played in the narrow lanes between the mud brick houses, and the smell of the evening meal began to gather as the day's heat softened. It was a real place, this village, full of real and ordinary lives, and the pyramid that loomed above it was, to the people who lived here, less a wonder of the world than simply the reason their fathers and husbands walked up the plateau each morning. Nefer worked outside her home in the softening afternoon light, grinding grain on a worn stone quern, the same patient labor that women had done in this land for longer than anyone could say. Her hands moved in the practiced rhythm of long habit, and the ground grain gathered slowly, to become the bread that would feed the workers again tomorrow. It was endless work, this feeding of the great labor, but it was honest and it was needed, and Nefer did it with the quiet competence of a woman who understood exactly how essential her own small part truly was. Inside the modest homes, the workers kept their small treasures, a clay figurine, a simple beaded amulet, the modest belongings of ordinary people living ordinary lives in the shadow of something extraordinary. These were not wealthy people, but they were not destitute either, and they carried the small comforts and beliefs that people everywhere carry, charms against misfortune, images of the gods they trusted, keepsakes that meant nothing to anyone but their owners and everything to them. In such small objects, more than in the great stones, the real texture of these vanished lives still quietly lived. From the plateau's edge, the whole valley of the Nile spread out in the late afternoon light, the green fields fed by the river's flood, the shining water itself, the distant villages scattered across the fertile land. This was the world the pyramid overlooked, the living, breathing world of Egypt, and the great monument stood as a bridge between that world and another, the eternal world the king would enter when his own life ended. Kaha paused at the plateau's edge, as he sometimes did, and looked out over that fertile valley, and felt the quiet contentment of a man who knew his place within a very large and very old order of things. As the sun sank toward the horizon, the great pyramid caught the golden light of late afternoon, its pale casing stones glowing warm against the deepening sky, and the work gangs, small as insects across its vast surface, began to finish the labor of another day. It was, Kaha thought, watching the light move across the stone, the most beautiful hour on the plateau, when the harsh white glare of midday softened into gold and the pyramid seemed almost to glow from within. He had seen it 1,000 times, and it had never once failed to move him. Kaha stood a while at the edge of the plateau as the day ended, looking out over the Nile as it caught the last of the light, and let himself feel the quiet pride that his work allowed him. He would not see this pyramid finished, most likely. It would rise for years yet, long after his own strength failed, and its completion would belong to younger men, to boys like Ta just now learning the ropes. But he had been part of it, had given his life's best labor to it, and it would stand, he knew, for longer than he could possibly imagine. The workers walked home toward the village as the light failed, small silhouetted figures on the sandy path, the great pyramid dark and vast against the golden sky behind them. Their day was done, and the ordinary comforts of the evening waited, the meal, the family, the rest that honest labor had earned. Kaha walked among them, tired in the good way that a full day's work makes a man tired, and thought, as he often did at this hour, of nothing in particular, content simply to be walking home at the end of another ordinary day. And the great pyramid stood on its plateau as the last light faded, rising vast and pale against a deep golden and violet sky, the Nile a soft ribbon of light in the distance, serene and timeless and utterly unbothered by the small human lives that labored at its feet. It would stand there, this thing that ordinary hands had raised, through more ages than any of its builders could dream of, and it would still be standing, almost alone among all the works of that ancient world, when nearly everything else had crumbled into dust. But that was a story for the ages to come. Tonight, there was only the quiet plateau, and the fading light, and the workers walking home. The season of the flood came, as it came every year, the great river swelling and rising until it spilled across the fields on either side, drowning the black earth beneath its life-giving water, and with it came a change in the rhythm of the work on the plateau. For in the months of the flood, the farmers could not work their drowned fields, and so many of them came instead to labor on the pyramid, swelling the work gangs to their fullest strength, tens of thousands of hands all bent to the single vast task. Kaha had always found the flood season the busiest and the most alive of all the year on the plateau, the gangs at their fullest, the stones rising fastest, the whole great enterprise humming with the energy of a nation turned, for these few months, toward a single purpose. He remembered his own first flood season on the plateau, brought as a boy by his father to learn the trade, overwhelmed by the sheer number of workers, the noise, the dust, the scale of a thing he could not yet begin to comprehend. He had grown into it slowly, across the years, as every worker did, until the impossible had become merely the ordinary work of his days, and the pyramid that had once stopped his young heart with awe had become simply the place where he went each morning to shape and set his stones. And yet, even now, even after all these years, there were still mornings when the flood was at its height and the gangs at their fullest and the great structure rising against the sky, when Kaha would pause in his work and feel again, for just a moment, the pure astonishment of his boyhood, the sense of being part of something almost beyond the power of the human mind to hold. It was a good thing, he had come to believe, for a man to work at something larger than himself, something that would outlast him, something that connected his own small ordinary hands to a purpose that reached across the ages. Most men, he knew, lived and died and left nothing behind but the children of their bodies and the memory of those who had loved them. But he and his gang, and the thousands who labored beside them, would leave behind this vast and enduring thing, and though their individual names would be forgotten, their collective work would stand, and in standing, would remember them, in a way that few ordinary lives were ever remembered at all. Ta learned quickly, as Kaha had judged he would, and across that flood season the boy grew from an eager but clumsy new hand into a genuinely useful member of the gang, his young muscles hardening to the work, his sense of the shared rhythm of the ropes growing surer with each passing day. Kaha took a particular satisfaction in the boy's progress, the quiet pleasure of a craftsman watching his knowledge take root in a younger mind, and he found himself teaching Ta more than the mere mechanics of the labor, passing on, without quite meaning to, the whole philosophy of the work that Inini had once passed to him. He taught the boy that good work was its own reward, that a stone set true and level was a thing to take pride in whether any eye ever saw it or not. He taught him that the gang was stronger than the sum of its men, that many hands pulling as one could move what no single strength could budge, and that a worker's first duty was to find the shared rhythm and hold to it. He taught him to respect the stone, to read its grain and its faults, to work with its nature rather than against it. And he taught him, above all, the strange and difficult patience that the work demanded, the willingness to give a lifetime to a thing one would never see completed, to labor toward a horizon that would always recede beyond one's own reach. Ta absorbed these lessons the way the young absorb everything, half-consciously, storing them away against a future in which he would understand them fully, and Kaha watched the process with the quiet contentment of a man who knew that his own knowledge, hard-won across a lifetime, would not die with him but would pass forward, into younger hands, and through them into hands not yet born. This too, he had come to understand, was a kind of building, a kind of pyramid, the slow patient raising of knowledge from one generation to the next, each worker adding his own course to a structure of skill and wisdom that had been rising, in its own invisible way, for as long as men had shaped stone. And it pleased him, teaching the boy, to feel himself a part of that longer and less visible building as well, one more pair of hands passing forward what had been passed to him. Inini grew older across those years, his strength slowly failing as the strength of the old always fails, until the day came when he could no longer climb the plateau to work, and took instead to sitting in the shade of his home in the village, offering his wisdom to the younger men who came to him with their questions. Kaha visited the old man often in those final years, sitting with him in the cool of the evening, listening to the stories he told of the pyramids of earlier kings, of the workers who had built them, of a whole vanished world of labor and craft that lived on now only in the memory of this one aging man. Inini did not fear his own ending, or if he did not show it. He had lived a long life, and a good one, and had given his best years to a work that would stand for ages, and he faced the approach of his own death with the same steady patience he had brought to every stone he had ever set. He spoke to Kaha, in those evenings, of the things he had learned across his long life, not only of stone and tools but of people, of how to lead men without breaking them, of how to find contentment in labor rather than despite it, of how to make peace with a life spent building something one would never see finished. Kaha listened, and remembered, and understood that he was receiving, in these quiet evening conversations, the last and most valuable teaching the old man had to give, the distilled wisdom of a whole life, offered freely to a younger man who would carry it forward. When Inini died at last, quietly, in his sleep, in the modest home he had lived in his whole life, the whole village mourned him, for he had been among the eldest and the most respected of them all, and his passing marked the ending of something larger than a single life, the loss of a living link to the workers and the kings of an earlier age. Kaha grieved him deeply, and honored him as the village honored all its dead, and carried forward, in his own work and his own teaching, everything the old man had given him, so that Inini's knowledge, at least, did not die with his body but lived on in the hands he had shaped. The years passed on the plateau in the steady rhythm of the work, flood season giving way to planting and planting to harvest and harvest back to flood, and the pyramid rose slowly, course by course, toward its distant completion. Kaha married, in those years, a woman of the village named Merit, and in time they had children of their own, and Kaha found in his growing family the same quiet contentment he found in his work, the sense of building something that would outlast him, of adding his own small course to the long structure of the generations. His days settled into a comfortable pattern, the walk to the plateau in the morning, the labor of the gang through the working hours, the return to the village and his family in the evening, the whole of it repeating with the reassuring regularity of the seasons themselves. It was not an exciting life, by the measure of kings and priests and the great ones of the land. But Kaha had never wanted excitement. He wanted good work, and a full table, and a family to love, and the quiet knowledge that his labor mattered, and these things he had in abundance. He watched his children grow as he had watched Ta grow, teaching them what he could, passing forward what had been passed to him, and he found in their growth the same deep satisfaction he found in a stone set true. His son took an early interest in the work of the plateau, and Kaha, remembering his own boyhood, brought the boy up to see the pyramid, and watched his young face fill with the same astonishment that had once filled his own, and felt the strange circular pleasure of a life repeating its own best patterns across the generations. This was how a world was built, he understood, not in the grand gestures of kings but in the patient accumulation of ordinary lives, each one adding its small course, each one passing forward what it had received, the whole vast structure of human civilization rising as slowly and as surely as the pyramid itself, one careful stone at a time. And though he would never have put it in such words, Kaha felt himself, in his quiet and ordinary way, to be a part of that greater building, one worker among the countless millions whose small and forgotten labors had, together, raised the whole world he lived in. Ta, meanwhile, grew into a man across those years, and a skilled one, until the day came when he was no longer the boy Kaha was teaching but a mason in his own right, leading his own portion of the work, teaching younger boys the same lessons Kaha had once taught him. It gave Kaha a deep and quiet pleasure to see it, the knowledge he had planted come to full flower, the boy he had shaped now shaping others in his turn, the long chain of the craft continuing unbroken into the next generation. He and Ta remained close across all those years, the bond between a teacher and his best student deepening into something like the bond between a father and a son, and Kaha came to rely on the younger man as he had once relied on Anini, turning to him now for the strength and energy that his own aging body could no longer fully summon. For Kaha too was growing older, as all men do, the years of hard labor slowly taking their toll on his back and his hands and his knees, until he found that he could no longer do the heaviest work himself, and took instead, as Anini had before him, to the lighter tasks of marking and measuring and directing, letting the younger men do the hauling and the lifting he had once done so tirelessly. He did not resent this slow diminishment, this gradual handing over of the physical work to younger hands. It was the natural order of things, the way it had always been and always would be, the old giving way to the young as surely as one season gave way to the next. And there was, he found, a particular satisfaction in this later kind of work, the work of knowledge and judgment rather than raw strength, the work of a man who had spent a lifetime learning his craft and could now offer that learning to the whole gang. He became, in those later years, what Anini had once been to him, the wise elder of the work, the keeper of the accumulated knowledge, the man the younger workers came to with their hardest problems. And he found in that role a fitting culmination to his long life of labor, the natural and honorable ending of a mason's working years, and he embraced it with the same steady contentment he had brought to every other stage of his ordinary and quietly meaningful life. The Great Pyramid neared its completion in the last years of Kaha's working life, the vast structure rising at last toward its final height, the capstone that would crown it being prepared in the workshops below. Kaha had labored on this single monument for the whole of his adult life, had watched it grow from a broad low foundation into the largest thing in all the world, and now, in his aging years, he would live to see it very nearly finished, a thing he had scarcely dared to hope for in his younger days. The final stages of the work carried a particular energy, the whole plateau sensing that the end of the long labor was finally in sight, and even the oldest workers, who had thought they would never see it, allowed themselves to imagine the day when the last stone would be set and the Great Pyramid would stand complete. Kaha found himself, in those final years, thinking often of the whole long span of the work, of the thousands upon thousands of workers who had labored on it across the decades, of the ones like Anini who had not lived to see it finished, of the boys like Ta who had grown to manhood in its shadow. So many lives had been given to this single thing, so many ordinary human years poured into the raising of it, and now, at last, it was nearly done. He wondered, sometimes, what the workers of the future would think of it, whether they would remember the ones who had built it, whether they would understand that it had been raised not by gods or by magic but by the patient labor of ordinary human hands, fed on bread and beer, paid for their work, proud of their gangs, walking home to their families each evening down the sandy path from the plateau. He hoped, in some quiet corner of himself, that they would remember, that the truth of the work would not be lost, that some trace would remain to tell the ages to come that ordinary people had built this extraordinary thing. But he did not dwell on such thoughts. There was still work to be done, still stones to be set, still a pyramid to be finished, and Kaha gave himself to that work, as he had given himself to it his whole life long, one careful stone at a time. The workers of the plateau did not labor endlessly without rest, for the calendar of Egypt was rich with festivals, days set aside for the honoring of the gods, when the gangs laid down their tools and the whole village turned to celebration. Kaha had always loved these festival days, the breaks in the long rhythm of the work, the chance to rest his aching body and spend the daylight hours with his family rather than on the stones. On such days the village came alive with a different energy, the ovens baking not the daily ration but the special breads and cakes of celebration, the beer flowing more freely than usual, music and dancing filling the narrow lanes between the mud brick houses. The workers honored many gods, but above all they honored those connected to their own labor and their own lives, the gods of craftsmen, the goddess who protected the workers, the deities of the great river that fed them all. There were processions, and offerings, and the particular joy of a hard-working people given permission, for a day, to set their work aside and simply live. Kaha would take his children through the celebrating village on these days, letting them share in the sweets and the music, and he found in these festival hours a happiness as deep, in its own way, as the satisfaction he found in his work. For a life, he had come to understand, was not only labor, however meaningful that labor might be. A life was also rest, and celebration, and the company of those one loved, and the small ordinary joys that gave the hard work its meaning and its reward. The workers of the plateau understood this well, and their festivals were not mere idle breaks but a necessary part of the whole rhythm of their lives, the counterweight to their labor, the reminder that they built the Great Pyramid not as slaves driven by fear but as free people who also knew how to laugh and dance and celebrate the gods who watched over them. And when the festival ended and the workers returned to the plateau, they returned refreshed, their spirits renewed, ready to take up again the long patient labor that would, in the end, raise a wonder that would outlast every festival and every celebration and every one of the ordinary joyful lives that had, together, built it. The work of building was dangerous, for all the care the workers took, and injuries were a part of life on the plateau, a crushed hand, a broken leg, a back wrenched beyond repair by the strain of the heavy hauling. But here too the workers of Egypt were cared for in a way that later ages would find surprising, for the village had its physicians, skilled in the setting of bones and the treatment of wounds, and an injured worker was not simply cast aside but tended and healed and, whenever possible, returned to the work. Kaha had seen many injuries across his long years on the plateau, and had suffered his own share of them, and he knew the value of the care the physicians provided, the difference it made to a worker to know that if he were hurt in the labor, he would not simply be abandoned. He remembered a young man of his gang, some years past, whose leg had been badly broken when a stone shifted unexpectedly, and how the physicians had set the bone and tended the man for many weeks, until at last he walked again, and returned, in time, to the work. Such care was not charity, exactly, but neither was it merely calculation. It was, Kaha thought, a reflection of the whole spirit in which the great work was done, the understanding that the workers were valued, that their lives mattered, that they were building the pyramid not as expendable tools but as skilled and respected craftsmen whose health and strength were worth preserving. He had heard, again, the tales that travelers told of other lands, where laborers were worked until they died and then simply replaced, and he did not understand such a way of building, could not imagine that it would produce work of any lasting worth. Here, on the plateau, the workers were cared for, and in return they gave their best labor, freely and with pride, and the pyramid rose the faster for it. There was a lesson in this, Kaha felt, though he would not have known how to speak it, a truth about the way that great things were best accomplished, not through cruelty and fear but through respect and care and the willing labor of people who knew their work was valued. It was a truth the builders of the pyramid understood in their bones, and it was written, invisibly, into every stone they set. Beyond the masons and the haulers, the great work of the plateau depended on a whole host of other trades, each essential to the whole, each contributing its own skill to the raising of the monument. There were the coppersmiths, who worked without rest to sharpen and repair the copper tools that the constant cutting of stone wore down so quickly, for a mason's chisel dulled fast against the limestone and dulled faster still against the hard granite, and without the smiths to keep them sharp the whole work would have ground to a halt. There were the carpenters, who built and repaired the wooden sledges and the ramps and the levers that moved the great stones. There were the rope makers, whose thick ropes of papyrus and palm fiber bore the enormous strains of the hauling. There were the boat crews who brought the stone down the river, and the scribes who kept the careful records of the work, and the overseers who organized the gangs, and the priests who attended to the sacred dimensions of the whole enterprise. Kaha had come, across his long years, to appreciate the full complexity of the work, the way that his own labor as a mason depended on the labor of 100 other trades, the way that the whole vast enterprise was woven together from countless separate skills into a single unified effort. No one worker, however skilled, could have raised the pyramid alone. It was the work of thousands, of many trades, of a whole organized society bent to a single purpose, and there was a kind of wonder in that organization itself, Kaha thought, almost as great as the wonder of the finished monument. That so many people, of so many different skills, could be brought together and coordinated toward a single distant goal, could labor for decades in patient cooperation, could feed and house and care for themselves while raising the largest structure the world had ever seen. This was an achievement of a different kind, less visible than the pyramid but no less remarkable. It was the achievement of a people who had learned to work together on a scale never before attempted, and the pyramid was, in a sense, merely the visible monument to that deeper and more remarkable accomplishment, the standing stone testament to what human beings could achieve when they organized their ordinary labors toward a common end. The precise alignment of the Great Pyramid was the work of the priests and the astronomers, who studied the movements of the stars and the sun with a patience and a skill that Kaha, for all his mastery of stone, could only marvel at from a distance. For the pyramid was not merely piled up in whatever manner was easiest, but oriented with astonishing exactness to the cardinal directions, its sides facing true north and south and east and west, its whole vast bulk aligned to the eternal movements of the heavens. Kaha did not fully understand how the priests achieved this alignment, the careful observations of the stars, the sightings taken across the long nights, the geometry that translated the movements of the heavens into lines drawn upon the earth. But he understood its importance, the sense that the pyramid was meant to connect the earthly world to the eternal world above, to serve as a bridge between the life of the king and the life of the stars, and he took a quiet pride in knowing that the stones he set were part of a structure so carefully attuned to the order of the cosmos itself. On clear nights, sometimes, walking home late from the plateau, Kaha would look up at the same stars the priest studied, the countless points of light wheeling slowly across the dark sky, and feel the strange connection between his own small labor and the vast eternal order those stars represented. He was a mason, an ordinary worker, his hands rough with the shaping of stone. And yet the stone he shaped was being fitted into a structure aligned to the very heavens, a structure meant to endure for all eternity, a structure that connected the humblest worker on the plateau to the eternal order of the cosmos itself. There was a humility in this, and also a strange exaltation, the sense that even the most ordinary human labor could be part of something reaching far beyond the ordinary, could touch, in its own small way, the eternal. Kaha did not have the words for such thoughts, and did not try to find them. But he felt them, on those clear nights, looking up at the stars, and they gave to his ordinary labor a dimension of meaning that sustained him through the long years of patient work. Once, and only once in all his years on the plateau, Kaha saw the king himself, come to inspect the progress of the great tomb that would house his eternal spirit. It was a day Kaha would remember for the rest of his life, the whole plateau brought to a halt, the work gangs assembled, the priests and officials in their finest linen, and then, borne in a great carrying chair, surrounded by fan-bearers and attendants, the living God himself, the king for whom the whole vast labor was being undertaken. Kaha, standing among his gang, caught only a distant glimpse of the royal figure, a small and remote presence surrounded by the trappings of a power almost beyond comprehension. And yet he felt, even at that distance, the strange weight of the moment, the sense of standing in the presence of the one for whom the pyramid was rising, the one whose eternal destiny his own ordinary labor was helping to secure. The king did not speak to the workers, of course, did not acknowledge them individually, moved through the plateau in a sphere of majesty utterly removed from their ordinary lives. But Kaha did not resent this distance. It was simply the order of the world, as fixed and natural as the flooding of the Nile or the movement of the stars, the king above and the workers below, each with their place, each with their part in the great enterprise. And there was, Kaha found, a kind of meaning even in his own remoteness from the king he served, the sense that his labor connected him, however distantly, to the very center of the world, to the living God whose tomb he was helping to raise. He returned to his work when the king had gone, and the plateau resumed its ordinary rhythm, and the great labor continued as it had continued for years. But Kaha carried the memory of that distant royal figure for the rest of his days, and told the story of it, in later years, to his children and his grandchildren, the day he had seen the king, the day the living God had come to the plateau to look upon the great work that ordinary hands like his own were raising toward the eternal sky. Kaha's children grew across those years, as children do, and in their growth he found the same deep satisfaction he found in the rising of the pyramid, the sense of building something that would outlast him. His eldest son, following the pattern Kaha himself had followed, took to the work of the plateau, apprenticed to the masons, began the long slow process of learning the craft that had been his father's life. Kaha watched the boy's progress with a pride he did not often speak aloud, the particular joy of a craftsman watching his own knowledge take root in his own child, the craft passing from his hands into the hands of his blood. He taught the boy as Anini had taught him, as he had taught Ta, patiently, across the years, not only the mechanics of the work but the whole philosophy of it, the respect for the stone, the value of good work done for its own sake, the strange patience of building toward a horizon one would never reach. And he found, teaching his own son, a completion of something, the closing of a circle that had begun when his own father had first brought him to the plateau as a boy. The knowledge that had been passed to him, he now passed forward, into his own child, and through that child it would pass forward again, into a future Kaha would never see. This was how the world endured, he had come to understand, not through the great monuments alone but through this quieter passing forward of knowledge and skill and wisdom from one generation to the next, the invisible pyramid of learning rising as surely as the visible pyramid of stone. His son would build things Kaha would never see, would teach children not yet born, would carry forward into the future the craft that Kaha had spent his life perfecting. And in that continuation, Kaha found a kind of immortality more real, perhaps, than the eternal stone of the pyramid itself, the immortality of knowledge passed forward, of a craft continued, of a life's work living on in the hands of those who came after. He was growing old now, and he knew it, and he made his peace with it, as Anini had made his peace before him, secure in the knowledge that the things he valued most would not die with him but would continue, carried forward by younger hands, into a future full of promise he would not live to see. The day came at last when the Great Pyramid stood complete, the final capstone set in place high atop the vast structure, and the whole plateau erupted in a celebration such as Kaha had never seen in all his long years of labor. Decades of work, the labor of tens of thousands of hands, the lives of a whole generation of workers, all of it culminating in this single moment, the setting of the last stone, the completion of the largest and most perfect structure the world had ever known. Kaha, old now, no longer able to climb to the summit himself, watched from below as the capstone was set, and felt his eyes fill with tears he did not try to hide, the tears of a man who had given his whole life to this thing and had lived, against all hope, to see it finished. The pyramid rose above him, complete at last, its white casing stones gleaming in the sun, its perfect geometry reaching toward the eternal sky, a wonder beyond anything the world had imagined possible. And Kaha had been part of it. His hands had shaped its stones, his knowledge had guided its raising, his whole working life had been poured into it. He would die, he knew, before very many more years had passed. But the pyramid would stand for ages beyond his imagining, would remain when he and everyone he had ever known was dust and forgotten. And some small part of him, he felt, would stand with it, invisible but real, the labor of his hands built into its eternal stone, his ordinary life given a permanence that few ordinary lives ever achieved. He wept, watching the capstone set, and around him the whole plateau wept and cheered and celebrated, the workers who had given their lives to this thing sharing together in the joy of its completion. It was, Kaha thought, the greatest day of his life, the culmination of everything he had worked for, the moment when the impossible labor of decades finally became the finished wonder of the ages. And he was grateful, more grateful than he could say, to have lived to see it, to have been part of it, to have given his ordinary life to something so extraordinary that it would outlast the very civilization that had built it. Kaha lived a few years more after the completion of the Great Pyramid, quiet years, spent mostly in the village with his family, his working days behind him now, his body finally worn out by the long decades of labor. He was content, in those final years, as he had been content through most of his life, secure in the knowledge that he had done good work, had raised a family, had lived an honest and meaningful life in the shadow of the great monument his hands had helped to build. He spent his days in the modest ways of the old, sitting in the shade, telling stories to his grandchildren, watching the life of the village flow around him, offering his wisdom to the younger workers who still came to him with their questions. And often, in those final years, he would look up at the Great Pyramid where it stood on the plateau, complete now and gleaming, and feel the quiet pride of a man who had given his life to something that would endure. He thought, sometimes, of Enini, dead now these many years, who had not lived to see the pyramid finished, and he felt grateful for his own longer life, grateful to have witnessed the completion of the great work. He thought of Ta, a master mason now in his own right, still working on the tombs and temples that the kings continued to raise. He thought of his own son, carrying forward the craft into the next generation. And he thought of the countless workers, named and nameless, who had labored beside him across the decades, the whole vast community of ordinary people who had, together, raised a wonder. When Kaha died at last, peacefully, in his sleep, in the same modest village where he had lived his whole life, he was mourned by his family and his community and honored in the modest way of the workers, given a decent burial with the small provisions the ordinary dead of Egypt took with them into the afterlife. He had not been a great man, by the measure of kings and priests. But he had been a good man, and a skilled one, and he had given his life to something that would outlast him by ages, and in that, he had achieved a kind of quiet greatness of his own, the greatness of the ordinary life well lived, of the honest labor freely given, of the small hands that, together with countless other small hands, had built something eternal. The village at the foot of the plateau did not empty when the Great Pyramid was finished, for there was always more work for the skilled hands of Egypt, more tombs and temples to raise, and the community of workers continued, generation after generation, in the shadow of the monument their ancestors had built. Kaha's son grew into a master mason, as his father had been, and raised children of his own, and taught them the craft as it had been taught to him, and the long chain of the work continued unbroken into the years and the decades and the centuries that followed. The knowledge that Enini had passed to Kaha, and Kaha to his son, passed on again, and again, and again, each generation adding its own small contribution to the accumulated wisdom of the craft, the invisible pyramid of learning rising as steadily as the visible pyramid of stone had risen. And the workers of each new generation, walking up the plateau to their own labors, would pass the great pyramid that their ancestors had built, and would feel, perhaps, some faint echo of the pride that Kaha had felt, the sense of belonging to a long line of builders, of being part of something that reached back across the generations into a past almost beyond memory. The village lived its ordinary life through all those years, the bread baked and the beer brewed, the children born and the old ones buried, the festivals celebrated and the daily labor performed, the whole quiet rhythm of a working community continuing across the centuries. Kings rose and died and were entombed in their own great monuments. Dynasties came and went. The fortunes of Egypt waxed and waned across the long ages. But the village of the workers endured, or others like it did, the community of skilled hands that Egypt always needed, the ordinary people who did the actual work of raising the wonders that the kings imagined. And through all those years, the Great Pyramid stood on its plateau, complete and eternal, the monument to a labor that had ended generations before, the standing testament to the countless ordinary lives that had, together, raised it. It watched over the village as it had watched over Kaha, patient and timeless, and the workers who lived in its shadow went about their ordinary lives beneath it, building the smaller wonders of their own generation, adding their own small courses to the endless work of the world. The age of the Great Pyramid builders did not last forever, for nothing in the world of men lasts forever, and in time the power of the kings who had raised the great monuments began to wane. The vast resources and the immense organization required to build a pyramid like Kaha's were beyond the reach of the kings who came after, and the pyramids they built, when they built them at all, grew smaller and less perfect, until at last the great age of pyramid building passed entirely into memory. But the pyramid that Kaha had helped to raise remained, standing on its plateau above the Nile, outlasting the very age that had produced it, a monument not only to the king it had been built for but to a whole era of human achievement that had passed away. The Egypt of later ages looked back on the builders of the Great Pyramid with the same wonder that all later ages would feel, marveling at the scale and the perfection of a work that even they, with all their own skill, could no longer hope to equal. The pyramid became, even to the Egyptians themselves, a monument from a distant and half-legendary past, a work of ancestors so remote that their methods and their lives had begun to fade from memory. And yet it stood, gleaming still in its white casing stones, its perfect geometry undimmed by the passing centuries, a fixed point of permanence in a world of ceaseless change. Generations of Egyptians lived and died in its shadow, going about their own ordinary lives beneath the great monument their remote ancestors had raised, and the pyramid watched over them all, patient and eternal, keeping its silent testimony to the labor that had built it. It had been raised by ordinary hands, fed on bread and beer, and those hands had long since crumbled into dust, their names forgotten, their individual lives lost to memory. But their work endured, and in enduring, remembered them, in the only way that such vast and collective labors are ever remembered, not as individuals but as a people, a whole community of workers who had, together, achieved something that would outlast every one of them and the very civilization that had produced them, standing on its plateau above the timeless river, watching the centuries pass. The centuries turned into millennia, and the world that Kaha had known passed slowly away, its language changing, its gods fading, its very memory of itself growing dim. The Great Pyramid saw it all, standing on its plateau while the long ages rolled past, while Egypt itself rose and fell again, while new peoples and new powers came to the ancient land and left their own marks upon it. In time, the white casing stones that had made the pyramid gleam so brilliantly were stripped away, carried off by later builders to raise their own structures, until the smooth and perfect surface that Kaha's fellow workers had polished with such care was gone, leaving the rougher stepped core beneath exposed to the sky. The pyramid weathered, and aged, as even the most enduring things must age across the vastness of the ages, but it did not fall, did not crumble, remained standing through everything the long centuries brought, the one great survivor among all the wonders of the ancient world. Travelers came from distant lands to marvel at it, in age after age, standing at its base and looking up at its impossible scale and wondering, as all who saw it wondered, how such a thing could ever have been built. The Greeks came, and marveled, and wrote of it, counting it among the great wonders of the world. The Romans came, and marveled, and carved their own names into its ancient stones. Conquerors and travelers and scholars and the merely curious came across the centuries, each generation encountering the pyramid anew, each generation astonished by it, each generation wondering about the vanished people who had raised it. And through all those visits, all those centuries of marveling, the true story of the pyramid's building grew ever more distant and more legendary, the ordinary workers who had raised it fading further and further from memory, until at last it was widely believed that the Great Pyramid must have been built by vast armies of slaves, driven to their labor by cruel kings, dying by the thousands beneath the whip. It was a story that fit the imagination of later ages, that matched what they believed about the ancient world. But it was not the truth. The truth had been forgotten, buried as deeply beneath the accumulated centuries as Kaha's own bones were buried beneath the sands of his forgotten village. For the truth of the pyramid's building lay hidden, all those centuries, in the ground itself, in the buried remains of the village where Kaha and his fellow workers had lived, in the tombs where they had been laid to rest, in the countless small traces of their ordinary lives that the sands had covered and preserved. And though the world above had forgotten them, had replaced the memory of paid and skilled and respected craftsmen with the false image of driven and dying slaves, the ground kept its patient record, waiting across the millennia for eyes that would one day read it truly. The village where Nefer had baked her bread lay buried beneath the sands, its mud brick houses collapsed and covered, its ovens cold, its lanes silent. The tombs where the workers had been laid lay hidden nearby, the modest graves of ordinary people who had, in life, built the greatest wonder of their age. And in those buried remains lay the true story, waiting to be found, the story of who the builders had really been and how they had really lived and worked and died. It would be a very long wait. Millennia would pass before the eyes that could read the buried record finally came, before the sands were cleared and the village revealed and the true story of the pyramid's builders finally recovered from the ground that had kept it so faithfully. Through all those ages, the false story reigned, the story of slaves and whips and cruel kings, and the ordinary workers who had actually raised the pyramid remained doubly buried, their bodies beneath the sand and their truth beneath the accumulated misunderstanding of the ages. But the ground did not forget. The ground kept its record, patient as the pyramid itself, waiting for the day when the truth of Kaha and Nefer and Enini and Ta and all the countless ordinary workers who had built the great wonder would at last be lifted back into the light, and the world would learn, finally, that its greatest monument had been raised not by driven slaves but by free and skilled and respected people, fed on bread and beer, proud of their gangs, walking home to their families each evening down the sandy path from the plateau. The eyes that could read the buried record came at last in an age unimaginably distant from Kaha's own, an age of scholars and scientists who had learned to recover the past from the traces it left in the ground, to read the story of vanished lives in the buried remains of their villages and their tombs. They came to the plateau where the Great Pyramid still stood, drawn by the same wonder that had drawn every age before them, and they began, patiently, carefully, to dig, not into the pyramid itself but into the ground around it, searching for the traces of the people who had built it. And what they found, across years of patient excavation, transformed forever the world's understanding of the great monument. For they found the village, the buried remains of the settlement where the workers had lived, the collapsed mud brick houses, the bakeries where the bread had been made, the breweries where the beer had been brewed, the whole infrastructure of an ordinary working community. They found the great quantities of animal bones that showed the workers had been fed well, on meat as well as bread and beer, a diet far better than any driven slave would ever have received. They found the tombs of the workers themselves, modest but decent graves, laid out with care, some of them even inscribed with the names and titles of the men buried within, master masons, overseers, the leaders of the work gangs. And in the bones of the workers themselves, the scholars read the story of their lives, the healed injuries that showed they had been cared for by physicians when they were hurt, the wear that showed the hardness of their labor, the evidence of lives that had been difficult but not brutal, demanding but not cruel. Piece by piece, across years of patient work, the scholars assembled the true story, the story that the false legend of slaves had buried for so long, the story of free and skilled and respected workers who had built the Great Pyramid not in chains but with pride. And the world learned, at last, the truth that Kaha had hoped, in his quiet way, might someday be remembered, that ordinary people, valued and cared for and fed and paid, had raised the greatest wonder of the ancient world with their own free hands. Among the most moving of the scholars' discoveries were the marks the workers themselves had left, the names of the gangs painted and carved onto the stones, the proud declarations of the teams who had shaped and set each block. For the workers had labeled their stones with the names of their gangs, names full of pride and humor and devotion, the friends of the king, the drunkards of the king, the enduring gang, the vigorous gang, names that revealed the workers not as anonymous slaves but as organized teams of craftsmen with their own identities and their own pride in their work. These marks, hidden for millennia within the body of the pyramid and on the stones around it, spoke directly across the ages, the voices of the actual builders reaching forward through time to declare that they had been here, had done this, had been proud of it. It was as if Kaha's own gang, with the proud name they had carried, had left a message for the distant future, a message that said, "We built this, we ordinary workers, and we were proud of what we built." And the scholars, reading these marks, felt the direct human connection across the vast gulf of time, the sudden vivid presence of the actual people who had raised the great monument, no longer an anonymous mass of driven slaves but a community of named and organized and proud craftsmen, real human beings with real lives and real pride in their extraordinary work. The false legend of the slaves crumbled before this evidence, replaced at last by the truth that Kaha and his fellow workers had lived, the truth of free and skilled labor freely given, of a great wonder raised by ordinary hands that had known their work was valued. And the world, learning this truth, saw the Great Pyramid differently ever after, no longer a monument to cruelty and oppression but a monument to what free human beings could achieve when they worked together with pride toward a common goal, a monument, in the end, not to the king alone but to the countless ordinary workers who had actually built it, the Kahas and the Aninis and the Tas and the Nefers, the forgotten people whose forgotten labor had raised a wonder for the ages. The scholars could not recover the individual stories, of course, could not know that a mason named Kaha had led a gang, that an elder named Anini had taught him, that a boy named Ta had learned the ropes, that a woman named Nefer had baked the bread. Those particular lives, like nearly all the individual lives of the ancient world, were lost beyond any recovery, their names, if they had left any, scattered among thousands of others or vanished entirely from the record. But the scholars recovered something more important than any single name, the truth of how those lives had been lived, the shape and texture of the workers' world, the reality of who the builders had been. They recovered the village where the workers had lived, and could see the ordinary rhythm of that community, the bread and the beer, the homes and the families, the whole domestic world that had sustained the great labor. They recovered the tombs where the workers had been buried, and could see the care with which the ordinary dead had been laid to rest, the modest dignity accorded to people who had, in later legend, been imagined as expendable slaves. They recovered the evidence of the medical care the workers had received, the good food they had eaten, the pride they had taken in their gangs. And from all of this, they reconstructed the true story, not the story of any single worker but the story of all of them, the collective story of the community that had built the Great Pyramid. It was, in its way, a fitting kind of remembrance, this recovery not of individual names but of the shared truth of a whole people's lives. For the pyramid had been built not by individuals but by a community, by thousands of ordinary people working together, and it was fitting that they should be remembered together, as a community, their collective truth recovered even if their individual names were lost. Kaha had wondered, in his final years, whether the future would remember the workers, would understand that ordinary hands had built the great wonder. He could not have imagined the strange and patient science that would, across the vast gulf of the millennia, finally recover that truth. But the truth was recovered, in the end, and the ordinary workers who had built the Great Pyramid were remembered at last, not as slaves but as what they had truly been, free and skilled and proud. And so the Great Pyramid stands today, on its plateau above the river, as it has stood for more than 4,000 years, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, visited now by travelers from every land who come, as travelers have always come, to stand at its base and look up at its impossible scale and wonder at the people who built it. It has watched over the plateau through more ages than the mind can easily hold, through the rise and fall of empires beyond counting, through the slow turning of the centuries into millennia, and still it stands, patient and enduring, keeping its silent watch over the timeless river and the fertile valley it has overlooked since the dawn of history. In the light of early morning, when the sun first rises over the eastern desert, the pyramid catches the gold of the new day exactly as it caught it on the mornings when Kaha climbed the plateau to his labor, the same warm light spilling across the same ancient stone, the same slow dawn breaking over the same eternal land. The river still flows below, as it flowed in Kaha's day, though the great flood that once fed the fields has been tamed now by the works of a later age. The fields are still green, still fed by the river's ancient gift. And the pyramid still rises above it all, as it has always risen, the fixed point of permanence in a world of endless change, the one thing that has remained while everything else has passed away. There is a peace in its endurance, a deep and quiet reassurance in the simple fact that something built by human hands so very long ago should still be standing, should have outlasted so completely the civilization that raised it, should remain, patient and unchanged, while age after age of human striving rises and falls and fades into memory around it. It stands as a promise, perhaps, that the ordinary labor of ordinary hands can achieve a kind of permanence, that the small forgotten lives that build the wonders of the world are not entirely lost, that something of them remains, built into the enduring stone, watching over the ages with the same silent patience they brought to the raising of it. Imagine the plateau at night, as it must have been in Kaha's day, and as it still is, in its quieter way, in the deep hours when the visitors have gone and the great monument stands alone beneath the stars. The desert air grows cool after the heat of the day, and the vast sky fills with the countless points of light that the ancient priests once studied, wheeling slowly overhead in the eternal patterns that have not changed since the pyramid was young. The pyramid itself becomes a darker shape against the darkness, its great bulk sensed more than seen, a presence rather than a sight, looming vast and silent over the sleeping land. There is a stillness here at night that is older than history, the stillness of the desert and the stars, the stillness that Kaha himself must have known on the nights he walked home late from the plateau, looking up at these same stars, feeling the same cool air, sensing the same vast presence of the great work rising against the night. The sounds of the modern world fade in these deep hours, and something of the ancient quiet returns, the quiet of a world lit only by the moon and the stars, the quiet in which the pyramid was built and in which it has stood through all the long ages since. It is a good quiet, a peaceful quiet, the quiet of a thing at rest after its labor, the quiet of a monument that has nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear, that has already outlasted everything it needed to outlast and can simply stand, now, in patient eternal rest, beneath the wheeling stars. And if you let yourself drift, in the deep hours of your own night, toward that ancient plateau and that eternal quiet, you may feel something of the peace that the great monument has kept across the millennia, the deep slow peace of enduring stone beneath an eternal sky, the peace of a thing that has found its place in the vast order of time and needs nothing more than simply to remain, patient and unhurried, while the ages turn around it and the stars will slowly overhead and the whole restless world sleeps. Think of all the ordinary mornings the pyramid has seen, the countless dawns breaking over its ancient stone across the more than 4,000 years of its standing. Each of those mornings, someone somewhere looked upon it, a worker in Kaha's day climbing the plateau to his labor, a farmer in the fields below pausing to glance up at the great shape on the horizon, a traveler from a distant land catching his first astonished sight of it, a scholar in a later age studying its ancient stones. Morning after morning, age after age, the pyramid has greeted the rising sun, has caught the gold of dawn on its weathered face, has begun another of the countless ordinary days that together make up the vast expanse of its endurance. And each of those mornings has been, for someone, simply an ordinary morning, a day like any other, the sun rising as it always rises, the pyramid standing as it always stands, the ordinary business of ordinary life beginning again beneath the eternal monument. There is something deeply peaceful in this, in the sheer accumulation of ordinary mornings, in the way that the extraordinary pyramid has presided over so many countless ordinary days. For the pyramid was built, in the end, by ordinary people living ordinary lives, and it has watched over ordinary people living ordinary lives through all the ages since, and there is a fittingness in that, a quiet rightness, the extraordinary monument keeping its patient watch over the ordinary human world it was built by and for. Kaha lived an ordinary life, and gave that ordinary life to the building of something extraordinary, and in doing so, found a meaning that sustained him through all his years of patient labor. And the pyramid he helped to build has kept its watch over countless other ordinary lives across the millennia since, a silent reminder, perhaps, that the ordinary and the extraordinary are not so far apart as we imagine, that ordinary hands can build eternal things, that ordinary lives, lived well and given to something larger than themselves, can achieve a quiet greatness of their own. Consider the materials of the great work, the simple things from which the wonder was raised. The stone itself, the pale limestone cut from the plateau and the fine white limestone brought from across the river and the hard granite floated down from the distant south, the patient stone that the workers shaped and set and that has endured across the ages. The copper of the tools, mined and smelted and forged into the chisels and the saws that cut the stone, worn down by the cutting and sharpened again and worn down again in the endless labor of the smiths. The wood of the sledges and the levers and the ramps, brought at great effort to a land that had little timber of its own, shaped by the carpenters into the tools that moved the mighty stones. The rope of papyrus and palm fiber, twisted and braided into the thick cables that bore the enormous strains of the hauling. The mud of the bricks that built the village and the ramps, the simple Nile mud shaped and dried in the sun into the humble building blocks of the workers' world. The bread and the beer that fed the labor, made from the grain of the fertile fields, baked and brewed by the women of the village. From these simple things, these ordinary materials, the greatest wonder of the ancient world was raised, shaped by ordinary hands into something that would outlast the very civilization that produced it. There is a lesson in this too, perhaps, in the way that extraordinary things are built from ordinary materials, that the wonder lies not in the stuff itself but in the patient labor and the accumulated skill that shapes it. Kaha understood this, in his quiet way, the way that a lifetime of patient work with simple materials could produce something eternal. He worked with stone and copper and wood and rope, the ordinary materials of his ordinary trade, and from them he helped to raise a wonder. And the wonder stands still, built from those simple things, a monument to what patient hands can make from the ordinary stuff of the world, when they work with skill and pride and care across the long years toward a common and enduring goal. Think of the river, the great Nile that made all of it possible, that fed the fields and floated the stones and gave life to the whole civilization that raised the pyramid. The river has flowed through the land of Egypt since long before the pyramid was built and flows through it still, the same patient water moving north toward the sea as it has moved for ages beyond counting. In Kaha's day, the river's great annual flood was the central fact of Egyptian life, the swelling of the waters that drowned the fields each year and left behind the black fertile earth that fed the whole land. The workers of the plateau lived by the river's rhythm, their labor rising and falling with the flood, the farmers coming to build in the months when their fields lay underwater. The stones of the pyramid floated to the plateau on the river's current, the great blocks borne on broad boats down from the distant quarries. The whole life of the land flowed with the river, depended on it, was shaped by it, and the pyramid itself stood as a kind of monument to the river as much as to the king, the wonder that the river's gift of fertility had made possible. The river flows still, below the ancient plateau, though its great flood has been tamed now by the works of a later age, its waters controlled and directed by the engineering of the modern world. But it is the same river, the same water moving north through the same ancient land, the same patient current that floated the stones of the pyramid so very long ago. And the pyramid still stands above it, as it has always stood, watching the eternal river flow below, the two of them together, the enduring stone and the flowing water, the fixed monument and the moving river, keeping their ancient companionship across the ages. There is a peace in the river's flowing, the same peace there is in the pyramid standing, the peace of the eternal patterns of the world, the water that always flows and the stone that always stands, the endless cycle of the flood and the endless permanence of the monument, together holding the deep slow rhythm of a land older than memory. Imagine the seasons turning over the ancient plateau, the great cycle of the Egyptian year rolling past across the millennia. The season of the flood, when the river swelled and spread across the land, and the workers gathered in their greatest numbers to raise the stones. The season of growing, when the waters receded and the black earth emerged, rich and fertile, and the farmers returned to their fields to plant the grain that would feed the land. The season of harvest, when the grain ripened golden in the sun and was gathered in, and the granaries filled, and the whole land celebrated the river's gift. Round and round the seasons turned, year after year, age after age, the eternal cycle of the Egyptian year, and the pyramid stood above it all, watching the seasons turn below, marking the passage of the years with its own timeless permanence. In Kaha's day, the seasons shaped the rhythm of the work, the flood bringing the greatest labor, the growing and the harvest seasons bringing the farmers back to their fields. And the seasons shape the land still, though the flood is tamed now, the eternal cycle of growing and harvest continuing as it has continued since the dawn of Egyptian history. The pyramid has watched more than 4,000 of these cycles turn, more than 4,000 floods and plantings and harvests, more than 4,000 years of the eternal Egyptian round. It has seen the grain grow green and ripen golden and be gathered in, over and over, age after age, the endless agricultural rhythm of the fertile land it overlooks. And in all those thousands of turning years, the pyramid itself has not changed, has stood unmoved and unmoving while the seasons cycled endlessly below it, the fixed eternal point around which the turning year revolves. There is a deep peace in this too, in the contrast between the turning seasons and the unchanging stone, the endless cycle of growth and harvest and the permanent presence of the monument that watches over it. The seasons turn, and turn again, and the pyramid stands, patient and eternal, keeping its timeless watch over the eternal turning of the fertile years. Let your mind rest, now, on the simple image of the pyramid at rest, the great monument standing quiet on its plateau in the soft light of evening, its long day of visitors ended, the plateau growing still as the sun sinks toward the western desert. This is the hour Kaha loved best, the golden hour of late afternoon softening into the quiet of dusk, when the harsh light of day gives way to gentler tones and the great stone seems almost to glow with a warm inner light. The workers of his day walked home at this hour, down the sandy path from the plateau toward the village, their day's labor done, the ordinary comforts of evening waiting. And though the workers are long gone now, and the village long buried, the pyramid still keeps this quiet evening hour, still stands in the softening light as the day ends, still glows warm and golden as the sun sinks toward the desert horizon. The shadows lengthen across the plateau. The air begins to cool. The first stars appear in the deepening sky. And the great pyramid settles into the quiet of another night, as it has settled into the quiet of countless nights across the millennia, patient and unhurried, at peace with the ending of another of its endless ordinary days. There is nothing more for the pyramid to do, in these quiet evening hours, nothing more for it to prove or to become. It has already done everything it was built to do, has already outlasted everything it needed to outlast, has already achieved the permanence its builders dreamed of. And so it can simply rest, now, in the soft light of evening, standing quiet on its ancient plateau, watching the sun go down over the desert as it has watched it go down for more than 4,000 years. Let yourself rest with it, in these quiet hours, let your own day settle into the same soft peace, let the ending of your day be as gentle and as unhurried as the ending of the pyramid's endless days. There is nothing more for you to do tonight either, nothing more to prove or to become, only the quiet settling into rest, the gentle giving over to the peace of the ending day. Think of the hands that built the pyramid, the countless ordinary human hands that shaped and hauled and set its stones. Rough hands, calloused hands, hands worn hard by the endless labor, hands that knew the feel of copper tool and limestone block, of papyrus rope and wooden lever, of the whole rough material world of the work. Kaha's hands, and Anini's, and Ta's, and the hands of the thousands of workers whose names are lost, all of them bent to the same labor, all of them shaping the same stone, all of them together raising the same wonder. Those hands are dust now, have been dust for thousands of years, crumbled away with the bodies they belonged to, scattered and lost beyond any recovery. But the work those hands did remains, the stone they shaped still standing, the wonder they raised still watching over the ancient land. There is something moving in this, in the thought of all those vanished hands and the enduring work they left behind, the ordinary human hands long since returned to dust and the extraordinary monument they built still standing after all the ages. The hands are gone, but the stone remains, and in the stone, somehow, the hands are remembered, their patient labor made permanent, their ordinary work given a kind of immortality. Every block of the Great Pyramid was shaped by human hands, was hauled by human hands, was set in place by human hands, and every one of those hands belonged to a real person, with a real life, with hopes and fears and loves and sorrows now utterly lost to memory. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary lives, each one a whole world of experience, each one now gone beyond recovery, and yet all of them together preserved, in a sense, in the enduring work of their hands. Let your mind rest on those vanished hands, on the patient ordinary labor they performed, on the wonder they left behind. And find, perhaps, in the thought of them, a quiet comfort, the comfort of knowing that ordinary hands can build enduring things, that ordinary lives are not entirely lost, that something of us can remain, built into the work we leave behind, long after our own hands have returned to the dust from which they came. Think of Nefer, and of all the women of the village, whose labor fed the great work and whose lives sustained the community of the workers. The women who baked the bread and brewed the beer, who ground the grain and tended the ovens, who raised the children and kept the homes and did the endless domestic work without which the labor on the plateau could never have continued. Their work was less visible than the work of the masons and the haulers, left no marks carved into the stones, is remembered in no gang names or proud inscriptions. But it was no less essential, no less a part of the raising of the wonder. For the workers on the plateau were fed by the women's labor, sustained by the bread and the beer the women made, supported by the whole domestic world the women maintained. Without that labor, the great work could not have gone on. The pyramid was built as much in the village bakeries as on the plateau itself, as much by the women grinding grain as by the men hauling stone. And though the women left no visible mark on the monument, their labor is written into it just as surely as the labor of the masons, present in every stone that was raised by workers their bread had fed. There is a justice in remembering them, these women whose essential work has so often been forgotten, in recognizing that the great wonder was raised not only by the men on the plateau but by the whole community that sustained them, the women and the children and the old ones, all of them part of the vast collective labor that built the pyramid. Nefer ground her grain and baked her bread and brewed her beer, day after day, year after year, the endless essential labor that fed the great work, and though her name is lost like nearly all the others, her labor endures, invisible but real, in the monument her bread helped to raise. Let her stand, in your mind, for all the forgotten women whose forgotten work sustained the wonders of the ancient world, the essential ordinary labor that history so often overlooks, the quiet indispensable work without which nothing else could have been built at all. Think of the children of the village, the young ones who grew up in the shadow of the great work, who played in the narrow lanes between the mud brick houses while their fathers labored on the plateau and their mothers baked the bread. For them, the pyramid was not a wonder of the world but simply the fact of their childhood, the great shape that had always been there, the reason their fathers walked up the plateau each morning. They grew up with it, took it for granted as children take for granted the world they are born into, and some of them, in time, followed their fathers up the plateau to join the work themselves, adding their own labor to the raising of the monument that had watched over their whole childhood. Kaha's own children grew up this way, in the shadow of the pyramid, and his son joined the work as Kaha himself had joined it, following the pattern of the generations. And so the work continued, passed down from father to son, the children of one generation becoming the workers of the next, the whole long chain of the labor continuing unbroken across the years. There is a tenderness in the thought of those children, growing up in the workers' village so very long ago, living their ordinary childhoods in the shadow of the extraordinary work, playing their games and learning their world and slowly growing toward the labor that would be their own inheritance. They are gone now, of course, those children, gone these thousands of years, their childhoods long since ended, their whole lives lived and finished in the distant past. But they were real, once, real children with real childhoods, playing in the real lanes of a real village at the foot of the rising pyramid. And something of them remains, perhaps, in the enduring work their world produced, the wonder that watched over their childhoods and that watches, still, over the ancient land where they once played and grew. Let the thought of them rest gently in your mind, these ancient children, and let it carry you, perhaps, toward the gentle memory of your own childhood, toward the tender ordinary world in which you too once played and grew, before the labors of your own life began. There is a comfort, in the end, in the thought of all these ordinary lives, the workers, and the women and the children of the ancient village, living their ordinary days in the shadow of the great work so very long ago. For they were, in the end, people much like us, with the same ordinary needs and the same ordinary joys, the same love of family and the same pride in work and the same simple pleasures of food and rest and companionship. They woke in the morning and went to their labor and returned in the evening to their families, as we do. They celebrated their festivals and mourned their dead and raised their children and grew old, as we do. They lived ordinary human lives, full of the same ordinary human things that fill our own lives, and though they lived so very long ago, in a world so different from our own, they were not, in the end, so different from us. And there is a comfort in that, in the deep continuity of ordinary human life across the vast expanse of the ages, in the recognition that the people of the ancient world were people like ourselves, living lives like our own. The pyramid connects us to them, across the millennia, the enduring monument that their ordinary hands raised and that our own eyes still behold. When we look upon it, we look upon their work, we see what their ordinary labor produced, we touch, in a sense, across the vast gulf of time, the lives of the ordinary people who built it. And in that touching, that connection across the ages, there is a comfort, the comfort of belonging to the long human story, of being part of the same ongoing human enterprise that has produced, across the ages, all the wonders and all the ordinary lives that together make up the history of our kind. Let that comfort settle over you now, in the quiet of your own night, the comfort of belonging to the long human story, of being connected across the ages to all the ordinary people who have lived and labored and loved before you, the comfort of knowing that your own ordinary life is part of the same great continuous story, the endless human story that reaches back to the builders of the pyramid and forward into a future none of us can see. And so we come, at last, to the end of our story, or rather to the place where the story simply rests, for a story like this one has no true ending, only a quiet settling into peace. The pyramid stands still, on its plateau above the river, as it has stood for more than 4,000 years and as it will stand, most likely, for thousands of years more, keeping its patient watch over the ancient land. The workers who built it are gone, their names lost, their individual lives beyond any recovery, but their work endures, and in enduring, remembers them, the countless ordinary people who together raised the greatest wonder of the ancient world. Kaha lived, and labored, and grew old, and died, an ordinary man who gave his ordinary life to something extraordinary, and though his name is lost like all the others, the pyramid he helped to build still stands, and something of him, perhaps, stands with it, the patient labor of his hands built into the enduring stone. It is a good thought to rest on, at the end of the day, the thought of the enduring pyramid and the ordinary people who built it, the thought of ordinary lives given to lasting work, the thought of the deep continuity of the human story across the ages. There is peace in it, the same peace there is in the standing stone and the flowing river and the turning seasons and the wheeling stars, the deep slow peace of the eternal patterns of the world. Let that peace carry you now, into your own rest, as the story settles into its quiet ending and the night deepens around you. Think of the pyramid, standing quiet beneath the stars, patient and eternal, at peace with the ending of another of its endless days. And let your own day end as gently, as peacefully, as the pyramid's endless days, giving yourself over, now, to the quiet and the rest that the ending day has earned. The workers have walked home down the sandy path. The village has settled into sleep. The great pyramid stands quiet beneath the stars. And there is nothing more to do tonight, nothing more to solve or to remember, only the gentle settling into peace, only the quiet giving over to rest. Sleep well. This is the Hush Historian, and I will be here, softly, whenever you need me again.